July 16, 1945, 2:47 p.m. Moscow time, 3 hours before the world's first atomic bomb would explode in the New Mexico desert. A 34-year-old physicist named Klaus Fuchs sat alone in his Los Alamos office, sealing a manila envelope. His hands were completely steady. No tremor. No hesitation. Inside the envelope were 22 pages of technical specifications that represented 3 years of work by 130,000 people and $2 billion American dollars. The implosion design for a plutonium bomb, yield calculations, detonation sequences, material compositions, everything. Fuchs checked his watch. In 4 hours he would drive to Santa Fe and hand this envelope to a Soviet courier. In 6 hours, the bomb he had helped design would detonate at Trinity Site, 35 miles south of where he now sat. And Joseph Stalin would know the results before Harry Truman finished reading the coded telegram. Fuchs placed the envelope inside his jacket, locked his office, and walked down the hallway past armed guards who nodded respectfully. Dr. Fuchs, senior physicist, British mission, top secret clearance. Nobody suspected that the quiet German refugee was the most valuable Soviet intelligence asset in the Western Hemisphere. Nobody knew that for 2 years he had been photographing documents, memorizing equations, and passing atomic secrets to the NKVD at carefully arranged meetings that had never once been detected. He had made his decision in 1941, before Los Alamos even existed. The Americans and British would build the bomb first. That was inevitable. Their industrial capacity, their resources, their scientific talent made it certain. But if only the Western powers had atomic weapons, they would dominate the post-war world completely. The Soviet Union, devastated by German invasion, would be helpless against American nuclear blackmail. Fuchs convinced himself he wasn't committing treason. He was preventing catastrophe. He was creating balance. At 5:29 a.m. Mountain wartime, the desert lit up. The fireball expanded to 600 feet in 1 second. The temperature at the center reached 10 million degrees Fahrenheit, vaporizing the steel tower holding the bomb and turning sand into green radioactive glass for 800 yards in every direction. The shockwave arrived 40 seconds later at the observation bunker where General Leslie Groves stood next to Robert Oppenheimer, watching through welding goggles as their creation proved that humans could now destroy cities with a single weapon. Groves looked at his watch and did the math. The flash had been visible for at least 3 seconds from their position 10 miles away. The explosion was far more powerful than the most optimistic predictions. 20 kilotons, maybe more. He turned to Oppenheimer, whose face had gone pale, and said the only thing that mattered. "We need to call Washington immediately." By 7:30 a.m., Groves was on a secure line to the Pentagon dictating a coded message. Even on military channels, even after the test, operational security demanded careful language. Doctor has just returned most enthusiastic and confident that the little boy is as husky as his big brother. The light in his eyes discernible from here to Highhold, and I could have heard his screams from here to my farm. The message reached President Truman at the Potsdam Conference in Germany at 11:30 a.m. local time. Truman read it twice, his hands shaking slightly, then passed it to Secretary of State James Burns. Little boy meant the plutonium bomb. Big brother meant the uranium bomb already being prepared for Japan. Highhold was Groves's Virginia farm, 250 miles from Trinity. Light visible from that distance meant the weapon was even more devastating than predicted. Truman folded the paper and sat in silence for 3 minutes. He now commanded the most destructive force in human history. One nation, one weapon, one decision could obliterate entire cities. He made up his mind that afternoon. He would mention the bomb to Stalin, but reveal nothing specific, just enough to avoid diplomatic problems later. just enough to demonstrate American power without compromising American secrets. What Truman didn't know, what nobody in the American delegation could have imagined, was that Stalin already had the full technical report sitting on his desk in Moscow. Not vague descriptions, not estimates, the actual engineering data. Yield, 22 kilotons. Core temperature, 10 million degrees. Implosion system, 32 explosive lenses fired in perfect synchronization. Plutonium mass, 6.2 kilograms. Truman had received a coded poem. Stalin had received the blueprint. While Truman was reading his telegram in Germany, Klaus Fuchs was driving south from Los Alamos towards Santa Fe. The envelope in his jacket contained his eyewitness report of the Trinity test, which he had observed from a distance as part of the scientific team. He had spent 6 hours after the detonation writing down everything he remembered: the flash duration, the cloud formation, the shockwave timing, the crater dimensions. His report was more detailed than the one Groves had sent to Truman, because Fuchs understood the physics in ways that military officers did not. He parked 2 blocks from the meeting point on Castillo Street. His shirt was damp with sweat despite the car having driven through cool morning air. The envelope felt like it weighed 50 pounds. If a security patrol stopped him now, if anyone asked to see inside his jacket, he would be arrested within minutes and executed within weeks. Los Alamos security was paranoid. Mail was censored. Phone calls were monitored. Armed guards checked identification at every gate, but they never searched senior scientists driving into town on Saturday afternoons. Fuchs checked his watch. 3:58 p.m., 2 minutes early. His Soviet handler had drilled the protocol into him during training in New York. Never arrive early. Early means nervous. Nervous draws attention. He forced himself to wait, watching people walk past. A woman with grocery bags, 2 soldiers laughing, a priest walking toward the cathedral. Normal people living normal lives, completely unaware that the man sitting in the parked Ford was carrying information that would shape the next 50 years of human history. At exactly 4 p.m., he stepped onto the sidewalk. The courier was already there, pretending to study a map exactly as planned. The man looked up, made brief eye contact, and spoke the recognition code. "I come from Julius," Fuchs replied with the second half. "I come from Boston." The entire verbal exchange took 9 seconds. The man folded his map. Fuchs handed over the envelope as they passed each other on the sidewalk. No handshake, no conversation. The courier walked east. Fuchs walked west. 45 seconds from first contact to separation. The courier was Harry Gold, a 34-year-old chemist from Philadelphia who had been passing industrial secrets to Soviet intelligence since 1935. He drove directly to Albuquerque and caught the evening train to New York, carrying the envelope in a newspaper. 3 days later, he handed it to Anatoly Yatskov, the NKVD station chief operating under diplomatic cover at the Soviet consulate. Yatskov photographed every page using a Leica camera with specialized film that captured technical drawings without distortion. The photographs were developed, encoded, and transmitted to Moscow via encrypted diplomatic cable. The full Trinity report arrived at NKVD headquarters on July 19th, 3 days after the test. Lavrenti Beria, head of Soviet intelligence and director of the Soviet atomic program, read it in his office while drinking tea. He made notes in red pencil on 6 pages where Fuchs had included calculations that Soviet scientists had been struggling with for months. Then he walked the report personally to the Kremlin. Joseph Stalin was in a meeting with military advisors when Beria arrived. Stalin dismissed everyone else from the room and listened as Beria summarized the contents. The American bomb worked. The implosion design was viable. The yield was catastrophic. The United States now possessed a weapon that could destroy Moscow, Leningrad, and Stalingrad without sending a single soldier across Soviet borders. Stalin's face showed nothing. How reliable is this source? Beria had anticipated the question. We have had 4 separate sources inside the American program for 2 years. Every technical detail they have provided has been verified against our own research. This source personally witnessed the test. He is their senior theoretical physicist for implosion dynamics. There is no more reliable source in the world. Stalin nodded slowly. Send this to Kurchatov immediately. I want him to compare their design with ours. I want to know if they have solved problems we haven't. Igor Kurchatov headed Laboratory Number 2, the secret facility outside Moscow, where Soviet scientists were attempting to build their own atomic bomb. He received Fuchs's Trinity report on July 20th and spent 4 days analyzing it with his senior staff. Their conclusion was devastating. The American implosion design was more sophisticated than anything Soviet researchers had achieved. The explosive lens system worked. The plutonium core compression was viable. The Americans were at least 3 years ahead, possibly 5. Without the stolen information, Soviet scientists would have needed years of trial and error to solve problems that Los Alamos had already cracked. With the stolen information, they could skip directly to working prototypes. On July 24th, President Truman finally told Stalin about the atomic bomb. The conversation happened at Cecilienhof Palace in Potsdam during a break between conference sessions. Truman approached Stalin casually, trying to appear confident. We have a new weapon of unusual destructive force that we plan to use against Japan. He watched Stalin's face carefully, expecting shock or fear, or at minimum surprise. Stalin's expression didn't change at all. His eyes remained calm. His posture stayed relaxed. I hope you make good use of it against the Japanese, he said simply. Then he turned and walked away to rejoin the Soviet delegation. No questions, no requests for details, no reaction whatsoever. Truman stared after him, confused. Winston Churchill, who had been standing close enough to hear, pulled Truman aside. He didn't ask a single question. Not about the type of weapon, not about the test, nothing. It's as if he already knew. Truman shook his head. He probably doesn't understand the significance, or maybe he's too focused on Poland and Germany to care about the Pacific theater. What Truman couldn't imagine, what seemed impossible given the security around the Manhattan Project, was that Stalin knew more about the Trinity test than Truman himself. Stalin had read Fuchs's technical report. He knew the exact yield, 22 kilotons. He knew the core temperature, the detonation sequence, the crater size, the mushroom cloud height. Truman knew only what Groves had told him in coded language. Stalin knew what the senior physicist had documented in precise scientific terminology. That evening, Stalin met with his closest advisers in his quarters. Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov asked if the Americans had shared any details about their new weapon. Stalin lit his pipe and smiled coldly. They think they have a monopoly. They think we are peasants who can be frightened by big words. He turned to Beria. How long until we test our own bomb? 5 years, Beria replied. Possibly 4 if we use the American designs completely and our scientists verify rather than invent. Stalin's smile disappeared. Make it 3 years. I don't care what it costs. I don't care how many people you need. We will not be helpless while the Americans decide the fate of the world. Beria calculated silently. 3 years was barely possible, but only if they treated the stolen American designs as a complete blueprint. Soviet scientists could build an exact copy of the Trinity bomb, test it, verify it worked, then modify it for Soviet production. Thousands of hours of theoretical research could be skipped. Fundamental engineering problems had already been solved. The NKVD had stolen not just information, but time itself. On August 6, 1945, a B-29 bomber named Enola Gay dropped a uranium bomb on Hiroshima. The city vanished in fire and light. 80,000 people died instantly, vaporized or burned or crushed by the shockwave. 3 days later, another B-29 dropped a plutonium bomb on Nagasaki. 40,000 more dead. Japan surrendered on August 15th. The war ended, and America stood alone with a weapon that made conventional military power obsolete. Joseph Stalin watched newsreel footage of Hiroshima in his Kremlin screening room. The images showed a city that had simply stopped existing. Buildings gone, streets gone, people gone. Everything within 2 miles of the detonation point erased as if it had never been built. Stalin's face remained expressionless throughout the film. When it ended, he turned to Beria. 3 years, whatever it takes. What Stalin understood, what Truman was still learning, was that nuclear weapons had changed the fundamental nature of power. The nation with atomic bombs could threaten any enemy with instant annihilation. The nation without them would be helpless to resist. The balance of global power for the next century would be determined by who controlled nuclear technology. Right now, America had a monopoly. But monopolies built on secrets could be broken if those secrets were stolen. Klaus Fuchs continued working at Los Alamos through the end of 1945. He attended meetings about improved bomb designs. He contributed to theoretical papers on thermonuclear weapons. He passed every security review, every background check, every loyalty investigation. Security officers who monitored him saw a dedicated scientist who worked long hours and socialized little. They saw exactly what Fuchs wanted them to see. In Moscow, Beria was organizing the largest covert industrial program in Soviet history. Uranium mines opened in Kazakhstan under NK-4D supervision. Plutonium production reactors were constructed in secret cities that appeared on no maps. Tens of thousands of German scientists and engineers captured at the end of the war were transported to the Soviet Union and forced to work on nuclear research. A generation of Soviet physicists received the technical reports stolen from Los Alamos and were told to build exact copies as quickly as possible. The program had a single designation: Problem Number 1. Every other Soviet priority was secondary. Food, housing, civilian reconstruction, everything came after the atomic bomb. The goal was simple and absolute: build a Soviet nuclear weapon before the Americans realized their secrets had been compromised. Win the atomic race that the Americans didn't even know they were losing. By the time Truman returned to Washington in August 1945, Soviet engineers at a secret facility called Arzamas 16 were already constructing an exact replica of the Trinity bomb based on Fuchs's specifications. They called it RDS-1. The Americans would eventually call it Joe-1 when it detonated 4 years later. But in August 1945, nobody in the United States government knew the race was already over. They thought they had a permanent monopoly on atomic weapons. They actually had a 4-year head start that Klaus Fuchs had just reduced to a countdown. The clock was ticking, and the Americans had no idea. February 2nd, 1950, 4:17 a.m. London. Klaus Fuchs had been awake for 2 hours, sitting at his kitchen table in his Harwell apartment, drinking tea that had gone cold. He knew they were coming. The only question was when. 3 weeks earlier, MI5 had called him in for a routine interview about his time in America. Routine meant they suspected. The interview had lasted 6 hours. They asked about Los Alamos, about his travel to Santa Fe, about whether he knew anyone in the Soviet diplomatic service. Fuchs had answered every question calmly, denying everything. But he knew how interrogations worked. They were building a case. They would return. At 6:15 a.m., he heard car doors slam outside. 2 doors. That meant 2 officers. That meant arrest, not just questioning. He stood up, put on his coat, and walked to the door before they could knock. When he opened it, the lead detective's face showed surprise. Guilty men run or panic or demand to see lawyers. Fuchs did none of those things. He smiled politely, as if greeting guests for breakfast. "Gentlemen, I have been expecting you. Should I bring anything, or just myself?" The detective recovered quickly. "Just yourself, Dr. Fuchs. We have some questions about your wartime activities." Fuchs nodded and stepped outside, pulling the door closed behind him. He didn't ask what questions. He didn't ask about lawyers. He simply walked to the police car and climbed into the back seat. As they drove toward London, he lit a cigarette and watched the English countryside pass by the window. One of the detectives later told MI5 that Fuchs acted like a man going to give a lecture, not a man about to be interrogated for treason. What the detectives didn't know yet, what MI5 and FBI counterintelligence were only beginning to understand, was that Klaus Fuchs wasn't the only Soviet agent inside the Manhattan Project. He wasn't even the most damaging. He was simply the first one caught. Behind him was an entire network of spies who had penetrated the most secret military program in American history at multiple levels simultaneously. And most of them were still operating. The network had begun in 1941, before Los Alamos existed, before most Americans had even heard the term atomic bomb. Soviet intelligence had noticed something strange in American scientific journals. Prominent physicists were publishing papers on nuclear fission, then suddenly going silent. Enrico Fermi stopped publishing in late 1941. J. Robert Oppenheimer disappeared from academic conferences in 1942. Entire university physics departments went dark. NKVD analysts in Moscow understood immediately what this meant. The Americans were building the bomb, and the Soviets needed inside. Klaus Fuchs was recruited first, in Britain, not America. He had fled Nazi Germany in 1933 after joining the Communist Party as a university student. The Gestapo had wanted him arrested. He escaped to Britain and continued his physics research at Edinburgh. When Britain started its atomic program in 1941, Fuchs was invited to join because his theoretical expertise was desperately needed. British security officers knew about his communist past. They cleared him anyway. Britain needed physicists more than it needed perfect security. The NKVD approached him in August 1941 through a German communist émigré living in London. The recruitment conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. Would Fuchs be willing to share scientific information with the Soviet Union? Fuchs said yes immediately. He had already convinced himself that a Western monopoly on atomic weapons would lead to catastrophe. The Soviet Union, devastated by German invasion, would be helpless against nuclear blackmail. Sharing information wasn't treason in his mind. It was preventing World War III. Then, in 1943, Britain merged its atomic research with the American Manhattan Project. Fuchs was selected to join the British mission going to Los Alamos. The NKVD couldn't believe their fortune. Their agent was being handed access to the largest scientific program in history, with full security clearance and nobody questioning his background because British intelligence had already approved him. Fuchs arrived at Los Alamos in August 1943 and immediately began the most productive espionage operation of the war. But Fuchs had a problem American handlers didn't know about. He needed a courier. He couldn't just mail documents to Moscow. He couldn't use Los Alamos phones, which were monitored. He needed someone to physically carry information from New Mexico to the NKVD station in New York. The solution was a 34-year-old Philadelphia chemist named Harry Gold, who had been passing American industrial secrets to Soviet intelligence since 1935. Gold's life was built on lies, stacked on lies. He told his family he traveled for work as a chemical company representative. He told his employers he visited his sick mother on weekends. He told women he dated that he was a government consultant who couldn't discuss his work. None of it was true. Gold spent 1944 and 1945 traveling back and forth across America, meeting Soviet sources, collecting Manila envelopes, and delivering everything to Anatoly Yatskov at the Soviet consulate in New York. He lived in constant terror of being caught, but he never showed it. Neighbors described him as a quiet, nervous man who kept to himself. Nobody suspected he was the most important courier in Soviet intelligence. Gold's closest call came on June 3, 1945. He was scheduled to meet Klaus Fuchs in Cambridge, Massachusetts at 10 a.m., collect technical documents, then immediately take a train to Albuquerque to meet another source at 3 p.m. the next day. The schedule was impossibly tight, no margin for error. Then his train from Boston was delayed 4 hours by track repairs. He arrived in Albuquerque at 2:47 p.m., 13 minutes before the meeting. His source, a young Army sergeant named David Greenglass, was already walking away from the meeting point, assuming Gold had failed to show. Gold ran after him down a crowded street, caught up, grabbed his arm, and gasped out the recognition code while trying to catch his breath. "I bring greetings from Julius." Greenglass stared at him in shock. They were supposed to meet in a quiet alley, not on a public street with pedestrians walking past, but Greenglass reached into his jacket and handed over an envelope anyway. The exchange took 8 seconds. Both men walked away in opposite directions. Neither knew that an FBI surveillance team positioned across the street had photographed them by accident. The FBI was investigating suspected Japanese espionage in Albuquerque. They photographed everyone who looked suspicious. Gold and Greenglass made the file. But nobody reviewed those photographs until 1950, after both men had already confessed. David Greenglass was the network's least educated member and possibly its most dangerous. He was a machinist, not a scientist. He didn't understand the physics behind atomic bombs. He couldn't read the theoretical papers that Fuchs was passing. But he had something equally valuable. He worked in the machine shop at Los Alamos, where bomb components were actually manufactured. He saw the physical parts. He knew their dimensions. He could sketch the explosive lens molds, the plutonium core casings, the neutron initiator assemblies. His crude drawings gave Soviet engineers confidence that what Fuchs and others were describing theoretically could actually be built in practice. Greenglass had been recruited by his brother-in-law, Julius Rosenberg, a committed communist who ran a small spy network in New York, passing information about radar and military electronics. When Greenglass was drafted into the army and assigned to Los Alamos in 1944, Rosenberg immediately recognized the opportunity. He convinced Greenglass that helping the Soviet Union was a moral duty. America's capitalist government would use atomic weapons to dominate the world unless the Soviets had them too. Greenglass believed him, or at least he later claimed he believed him. By 1950, when FBI agents arrested him, Greenglass would say anything to avoid execution. But the network's most valuable source wasn't Fuchs or Greenglass. It was a 19-year-old physics prodigy from Harvard named Theodore Hall, who had access to information even Fuchs couldn't reach. Hall arrived at Los Alamos in January 1944, the youngest scientist on the project. He looked 16. He still had acne. Security officers joked about letting children into the technical area. But Hall's mind was already operating at a level that impressed Oppenheimer himself. Hall was assigned to work on the plutonium core, calculating isotope ratios and neutron initiator design. He knew details that Fuchs could only estimate. And Hall wasn't recruited by the NKVD. He recruited himself. On October 12, 1944, during a vacation in New York, Hall walked into the Soviet consulate on East 61st Street, wearing a Harvard sweater and carrying a physics textbook. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman who had spent 3 years dealing with lunatics, barely looked up. "We're closed to public visitors, young man." Hall didn't move from the doorway. "I work at Site Y. I need to speak to someone about atomic research immediately." The receptionist's pen stopped moving. Site Y was the code name for Los Alamos. That information was so classified that saying it out loud in Manhattan could get you arrested. She picked up the phone with a shaking hand. Anatoly Yatskov arrived in less than 3 minutes. He took one look at the teenager in the lobby and assumed it was some kind of FBI trap. Nobody that young could have access to atomic secrets. Nobody that young would voluntarily walk into a Soviet facility and announce themselves as a spy. It had to be provocation. But Hall spent the next 30 minutes describing the plutonium bomb design in technical detail that only someone actually working on the project could know. He explained why the implosion method was necessary. He described the explosive lens configuration. He gave Yatskov the names of senior scientists and their specific research areas. By the end of the conversation, Yatskov realized he was sitting across from the most valuable walk-in source in Soviet intelligence history. A teenage genius who had decided entirely on his own that Soviet scientists deserved access to American atomic research. Hall's motivation was different from Fuchs's ideological certainty or Greenglass's family loyalty. Hall had joined the Communist Party at age 16 because he believed capitalism had caused the Great Depression. When he arrived at Los Alamos and understood what they were building, he convinced himself that an American monopoly on nuclear weapons would be catastrophic. Not for the Soviet Union specifically, but for humanity generally. He reasoned that only a balance of nuclear power between superpowers would prevent one side from using the bomb to dominate the other. He was creating stability through espionage. At least that's what he told himself. By early 1945, Soviet intelligence had at least 4 separate sources inside Los Alamos. Fuchs providing implosion theory, Hall providing core engineering, Greenglass providing manufacturing specs, and possibly others whose identities remain unknown even today. Together, they gave Stalin a complete picture of American atomic research that was in some ways more detailed than what Truman received in his presidential briefings. The security failure was total. General Leslie Groves had implemented measures he believed were foolproof, background checks for everyone. Mail censorship, phone monitoring, armed guards, fences, restrictions on travel. Scientists forbidden from discussing work outside designated areas. Security officers watch constantly for suspicious behaviour, for people acting nervous or asking inappropriate questions. But the security system had a fundamental flaw. It assumed spies would look like spies. It assumed guilty people would act guilty. Fuchs, Hall and Greenglass all passed their security reviews precisely because they weren't nervous. They genuinely believed they were doing the right thing. They didn't feel guilty, so they didn't act guilty. Fuchs was described by colleagues as quiet, methodical, and completely dedicated to his work. Hall was seen as a brilliant but socially awkward teenager. Greenglass was just another machinist doing his job. None of them fit the profile of a spy. The courier system was nearly perfect. Harry Gold used recognition codes that allowed strangers to identify each other on crowded streets without arousing suspicion. "I come from Julius," and "I come from Boston," were phrases that meant nothing to anyone overhearing them, but everything to the participants. Meetings lasted less than 2 minutes. No names exchanged, no conversation, just an envelope changing hands and both parties walking away. FBI counterintelligence had zero chance of detecting meetings they didn't know were happening in cities they weren't watching. Gold delivered everything to Yatskov at the Soviet consulate in New York. Yatskov photographed documents using specialized Leica cameras, encoded the images, and transmitted them to Moscow via encrypted diplomatic cable or diplomatic pouch. The pouches were legally immune from search. The cables used Soviet one-time pad ciphers that were mathematically unbreakable as long as the encryption keys were never reused. But wartime pressure caused Soviet code clerks to make a catastrophic mistake. They reused encryption keys. The one-time pad cipher was only unbreakable if the keys were actually used one time. Reusing keys created mathematical patterns. American codebreakers at the Army Security Agency had been collecting Soviet encrypted cables since 1943, storing them for future analysis. In 1946, a team led by cryptanalyst Meredith Gardner began attacking the backlog. The reused keys created vulnerabilities. By 1948, Gardner had partially decrypted several messages from 1944. One message from June 1944 referenced a physicist codenamed Charles providing information about explosive lenses and implosion dynamics. American counterintelligence compiled a list of every physicist at Los Alamos whose name could match that codename. The list was very short. Klaus Fuchs was at the top. MI5 began investigating Fuchs in September 1949. They couldn't arrest him based on a partially decrypted Soviet cable. They needed a confession. They brought him in for interviews. They asked careful questions. They watched him closely. Fuchs denied everything for weeks. But on January 24, 1950, during his fourth interrogation, his resistance finally collapsed. He confessed completely. He described his recruitment in London in 1941. He named his Soviet handlers. He detailed every meeting with Harry Gold, every envelope he had passed, every piece of information he had provided. He explained his motivations without apology. He said he believed atomic weapons were too dangerous for any single nation to control. He said he would do it again if faced with the same choice. He expressed absolutely no remorse. Fuchs's confession destroyed the network. FBI agents arrested Harry Gold in Philadelphia on May 22, 1950. Gold's apartment was searched. Agents found maps of Santa Fe and Albuquerque with meeting locations marked. They found train tickets and hotel receipts that matched dates when atomic information had been passed. Confronted with physical evidence, Gold confessed within 12 hours. He gave up every source he had ever met, including David Greenglass. Greenglass was arrested in June 1950. He confessed immediately and identified Julius and Ethel Rosenberg to save himself from execution. The Rosenbergs were arrested in July. Julius refused to confess. Ethel refused to testify. Their trial began in March 1951. Both were convicted of conspiracy to commit espionage. Both were sentenced to death. Worldwide protests followed. Pleas for clemency came from Albert Einstein, Pope Pius XII, and Jean-Paul Sartre. President Eisenhower refused them all. On June 19, 1953, Julius Rosenberg was strapped into the electric chair at Sing Sing prison at 8:04 p.m. The executioner threw the switch. 2,000 volts for 57 seconds. Julius was pronounced dead at 8:06 p.m. Ethel Rosenberg was executed 8 minutes later. The first electrical charge didn't kill her. Witnesses reported smoke rising from her head and that she was still breathing after the standard cycle. The executioner had to apply the current 2 more times. She was finally pronounced dead at 8:16 p.m. after receiving 5 electrical shocks over 3 minutes. Outside the prison, 500 protesters held vigil, holding signs reading, "Mercy for the Rosenbergs." Inside, David Greenglass was serving his 15-year sentence in a federal facility. He would be released in 1960. In 2001, he admitted in an interview that he had lied under oath about Ethel's involvement to protect his own wife from prosecution. His testimony had sent his sister to the electric chair based on lies he invented to save himself. Theodore Hall was never caught. The decrypted Soviet cables that mentioned Hall used a codename American counterintelligence couldn't identify. Hall was questioned briefly in 1951, but denied everything and was released for lack of evidence. He moved to England, became a professor at Cambridge, and lived quietly until 1999. He was finally identified from declassified Soviet archives released after the Cold War ended. Historians confronted him in 1997. He admitted everything, but expressed no regret. He died in 1999, having never been prosecuted, having never served a day in prison, despite passing atomic secrets just as valuable as anything Fuchs provided. Klaus Fuchs was tried in London in March 1950. He pled guilty to 4 counts of violating the Official Secrets Act. The maximum sentence under British law was 14 years. He served 9 years in Wormwood Scrubbs prison, reading physics journals and corresponding with scientists. He was released in June 1959 and immediately flew to East Germany, where he became deputy director of the Institute for Nuclear Research. He died in East Berlin in January 1988 at age 76, still believing he had prevented World War III. His last interview was recorded in 1987 by a British journalist who tracked him down. The journalist asked if he had any regrets about passing atomic secrets to Stalin. Fuchs said no. He said his actions had created nuclear balance and prevented American nuclear blackmail against the Soviet Union. The journalist asked him about the arms race that followed, the 60,000 nuclear warheads that now existed because both superpowers had the bomb. Fuchs looked out the window and said nothing for 3 full minutes. Then he asked the journalist to leave. By the time Fuchs died in 1988, both superpowers had tested hydrogen bombs 1,000 times more powerful than Hiroshima. The arms race he claimed to have prevented had produced enough nuclear weapons to destroy human civilization multiple times over. His espionage had given Stalin the bomb years ahead of schedule, but it hadn't prevented the arms race. It had accelerated it. Whether Klaus Fuchs was a hero who prevented war or a traitor who enabled Stalin's nuclear program remains debated today. What isn't debated is the damage. A handful of scientists decided that sharing secrets with the Soviet Union was more important than keeping promises to the countries that had trusted them. The nuclear age had begun with secrets, and secrets, once stolen, can never be recovered. August 29, 1949, 7 a.m. local time, Semipalatinsk test site, Kazakhstan. Igor Kurchatov stood in a concrete bunker 10 kilometers from ground zero, watching a steel tower through a periscope. His hands were shaking despite the summer heat. On top of that tower sat RDS-1, First Lightning, a plutonium bomb that looked exactly like the American Trinity device. Same dimensions, same weight, same explosive lens configuration. Because it was a copy, an exact copy built from stolen blueprints. For 4 years, Kurchatov had lived under a death sentence. Lavrenti Beria had told him directly in 1946, "If this bomb doesn't work, you'll answer with your life." Kurchatov was 46 years old. His hair had turned completely white during the project. His colleagues said he had aged 20 years in 4. He hadn't slept more than 4 hours a night since 1945. Every calculation, every test, every component carried the weight of potential execution if something failed. The countdown reached 0. For 1 terrible second, nothing happened. Kurchatov felt his heart stop. Then the tower vaporized in a flash of light that turned the Kazakhstan steppe brighter than noon. The fireball expanded to 1,000 feet. The shockwave arrived 28 seconds later, rattling the concrete bunker hard enough that dust fell from the ceiling. Through the periscope, Kurchatov watched a mushroom cloud climb into the sky, identical to the photographs he had studied of Hiroshima and Trinity. The yield would later be calculated at 22 kilotons, exactly what the stolen American documents had predicted. Kurchatov turned away from the periscope and sat down on a wooden chair. Someone handed him water. His hands shook so badly he spilled half of it trying to drink. One of his assistants asked if he was all right. Kurchatov nodded but couldn't speak. The Soviet Union had just become the world's second nuclear power. And the Americans had no idea. What happened next was one of the most remarkable intelligence failures in American history. The US Air Force had been running Project Mogul since 1947, specifically designed to detect Soviet nuclear tests. High-altitude aircraft equipped with radiation sensors flew regular patrols along Soviet borders, collecting air samples. The theory was simple. A nuclear explosion releases radioactive isotopes into the atmosphere. Prevailing winds carry those isotopes east toward the Pacific. American aircraft would detect them within days. On September 3, 1949, 5 days after the Soviet test, a WB-29 weather reconnaissance aircraft flying from Japan to Alaska detected unusual radiation at 18,000 feet. Lieutenant Colonel John Fitzmaurice noticed his radiation counter clicking faster than normal background levels, not dramatically faster, just enough to be noticeable. He ordered his crew to collect filter samples from the aircraft's air intake system. When they landed in Alaska, those filters were sealed in lead containers and flown immediately to a laboratory at the Atomic Energy Commission headquarters in Washington. The filters contained cesium-137 and strontium-90, isotopes that could only come from a nuclear explosion. The ratios indicated plutonium fission, not uranium. The decay pattern suggested the explosion had occurred between 5 and 7 days earlier. The scientists analysing the samples ran the test 3 times because they couldn't believe the results. Then they called in additional experts from Los Alamos. Same conclusion. Somewhere in the Soviet Union, probably in Central Asia based on wind patterns, a plutonium bomb had detonated within the last week. The report reached the White House on September 14, 1949. President Harry Truman was meeting with his National Security Council when his science advisor, Dr. Vannevar Bush, arrived with the folder. Truman opened it and read the first page twice. His hand started shaking. He set it down carefully on his desk, as if the paper itself might explode. His advisors stood in silence, watching. Truman picked up his coffee cup, took a sip, then realized the coffee had gone cold hours ago. He set it down, picked up the report again, read the conclusion a 3rd time. Then he threw the report across the desk hard enough that papers scattered onto the floor. "That's impossible. They can't have it. Our intelligence estimates said 1952 at the earliest, probably 1955. How the hell did they build a bomb in 4 years?" Bush picked up the scattered pages and arranged them carefully. "Mr. President, the isotope analysis is conclusive. This wasn't a laboratory accident. This was a working plutonium bomb. And based on the fission signature, it's very similar in design to our Trinity device." The room went completely silent. Everyone understood what that meant. Someone had given them the blueprints. Truman sat back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. "We need to verify this before making any announcements, run more tests, get more samples, make absolutely certain." For the next 9 days, American aircraft flew continuous patrols collecting air samples. Every test confirmed the conclusion. On September 23, 1949, Truman finally made a public statement. "We have evidence that within recent weeks an atomic explosion occurred in the USSR." He didn't call it a bomb. He didn't admit the Soviets had built a deliverable weapon. He used the word explosion, as if maybe it had been an accident, a laboratory experiment gone wrong. But everyone understood. The American nuclear monopoly had lasted exactly 4 years and 1 month, and it had ended because American secrets had been stolen. The public reaction was immediate panic. Americans had lived since 1945, believing they possessed the ultimate weapon, and nobody else did. That belief vanished overnight. Newspapers ran headlines asking if Soviet bombers could reach American cities. Civil defense officials began planning evacuation procedures. Schools started teaching children to duck and cover under desks if they saw a nuclear flash, as if furniture would protect them from weapons that vaporized buildings. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover already suspected how the Soviets had succeeded so quickly. Klaus Fuchs had confessed in February 1950, explaining that he had passed complete plutonium bomb specifications to Soviet intelligence, including implosion lens configurations and core compression calculations. Fuchs estimated his information had saved Soviet scientists at least 5 years of research and development. The investigation that would eventually lead to Harry Gold, David Greenglass, and the Rosenbergs was already underway. But the damage was permanent. The Soviets had the bomb years ahead of schedule. President Truman faced a decision that would define the next 40 years. Accept that the Soviets had matched American nuclear capability, or escalate by developing something even more powerful. On January 31, 1950, Truman authorized development of the hydrogen bomb, the fusion weapon thousands of times more powerful than the fission bombs dropped on Japan. Scientists had known since 1942 that fusion was theoretically possible. You could use a fission bomb as a trigger to ignite fusion reactions in hydrogen isotopes, releasing energy equivalent to millions of tons of TNT instead of thousands. But nobody had tried building one because the engineering challenges were enormous, and the fission bomb had seemed powerful enough to end wars. Now it wasn't enough. If the Soviets had fission bombs, America needed fusion bombs. The arms race had begun. Lavrenti Beria summoned Igor Kurchatov to his Moscow office in March 1950. Kurchatov arrived expecting congratulations. The Soviet Union had successfully tested the atomic bomb. The program had succeeded. Instead, Beria slid a folder across his desk. Inside were American newspaper clippings about Truman's hydrogen bomb authorization. Beria lit a cigarette and watched Kurchatov read through them. The Americans are building something 1,000 times more powerful than what we tested. How long until we have one? Kurchatov felt his chest tighten. He set down the papers carefully. Comrade Beria, we have only tested one fission device. We need years to perfect fission weapons, build production facilities, and train personnel before attempting fusion research. The theoretical physics alone requires... Beria held up one hand. I don't need physics lectures. I need a timeline. Kurchatov did the calculations in his head. Without external help, without stolen designs, Soviet scientists would need at least 7 years to solve the fundamental engineering problems of fusion weapons. 7 years minimum, he said quietly. Possibly 10. Beria's expression didn't change. You have 3. If the Americans test their hydrogen bomb before we do, you'll be replaced. If they deploy fusion weapons and we don't have them, you'll answer for the failure personally. He didn't elaborate on what answering personally meant. He didn't need to. Kurchatov had watched colleagues disappear for smaller failures. He nodded and left the office. Outside, in the hallway, Kurchatov leaned against the wall and tried to steady his breathing. 3 years. Impossible. Soviet scientists barely understood fusion theory. They would need years of experimentation, thousands of calculations, testing programs that didn't exist yet. 3 years was impossible unless they got extraordinarily lucky, or unless someone in America made another catastrophic security mistake. The Americans tested first. On November 1, 1952, the United States detonated Ivy Mike at Eniwetok Atoll in the Pacific. The device weighed 82 tons, housed in a building-sized refrigeration unit to keep its liquid hydrogen fuel cold. It wasn't a deployable weapon. It was a laboratory experiment proving that fusion weapons actually worked. The yield was 10.4 megatons, 700 times more powerful than Hiroshima. The explosion vaporized the entire island of Elujalab. The fireball was 3 miles in diameter. The mushroom cloud climbed to 135,000 feet, penetrating deep into the stratosphere. Witnesses on ships 30 miles away felt heat on their faces like standing too close to a furnace. Soviet intelligence received reports about Ivy Mike within weeks. Kurchatov read them with growing despair. The Americans had achieved fusion ignition. The physics worked. Now it was just engineering. And Soviet scientists were years behind. Unless they could somehow accelerate their program, the Americans would achieve nuclear superiority that couldn't be matched. Beria's 3-year deadline suddenly seemed generous. The Americans had already done it in 2. But on August 12, 1953, less than 9 months after Ivy Mike, the Soviet Union detonated its first fusion device at Semipalatinsk. The yield was 400 kilotons, far less than Ivy Mike's 10 megatons. But the Soviet design was fundamentally more practical. It used lithium deuteride, a solid fuel that didn't require refrigeration. The bomb could actually be delivered by aircraft. The Americans had built a laboratory demonstration. The Soviets had built a deployable weapon. American intelligence was stunned. CIA analysts had estimated the Soviets wouldn't achieve fusion for 5 to 7 years. They had done it in less than 1. How? The answer was partly continued espionage, partly independent innovation by Soviet physicists like Andrei Sakharov, and partly the foundation that Klaus Fuchs and others had provided years earlier. The stolen atomic bomb designs had included preliminary research on fusion concepts. Soviet scientists hadn't started from zero. They had started from stolen American research and built on it with original work. The arms race became a self-sustaining machine. Every Soviet advance forced an American response. Every American response forced a Soviet counter-response. By 1955, both sides were testing weapons in the megaton range regularly. By 1960, both had deployed intercontinental ballistic missiles. By 1965, both had submarine-launched missiles that made their nuclear arsenals invulnerable to surprise attack. The strategy became known as mutually assured destruction. MAD. If one side attacked, the other would retaliate automatically, destroying both nations completely. Peace was maintained through the promise of mutual annihilation. The insanity had its own momentum. American military planners argued they needed more weapons because Soviet planners were building more weapons. Soviet planners made identical arguments in reverse. Nobody could stop building because stopping meant falling behind. Falling behind meant vulnerability. Vulnerability meant death. So both sides kept building, and building, and building, until the world was armed with enough nuclear weapons to kill every human being on Earth multiple times over, as if killing someone once wasn't sufficient. And then it nearly happened. On October 27, 1962, Soviet submarine B-59 was being depth-charged by American destroyers in the Caribbean during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The submarine had been submerged for nearly 24 hours. The air conditioning had failed. The temperature inside was 113 degrees Fahrenheit. Carbon dioxide levels were approaching lethal concentrations. The crew was on the edge of collapse. Captain Valentin Savitsky had lost radio contact with Moscow. He didn't know if war had started. He didn't know if Soviet forces were under attack. He only knew that American destroyers were dropping depth charges on his submarine, and he had authorization to respond with nuclear weapons if he believed war had begun. He ordered the nuclear torpedo armed. The torpedo carried a 15-kiloton warhead, the same size as the Hiroshima bomb. One torpedo into the American aircraft carrier group circling above would kill thousands of American sailors instantly. It would almost certainly trigger immediate nuclear retaliation. It would probably end human civilization within hours. Soviet naval procedure required 2 officers to authorize nuclear weapon launch. Captain Savitsky had authorization. His political officer had authorization. But the submarine's second-in-command, Vasily Arkhipov, refused. "We don't know if war has started," Arkhipov said. "We need to surface and get orders from Moscow before launching nuclear weapons." Savitsky screamed at him. The political officer screamed at him. The argument lasted 11 minutes while the submarine continued taking depth charges. The hull was groaning under pressure. Electrical systems were failing. Several crew members had passed out from heat and bad air, but Arkhipov wouldn't change his decision. He refused to authorize the launch. Finally, Savitsky backed down. B-59 surfaced. No torpedo was fired. No nuclear weapon was used. Nobody in Washington knew how close they had come to starting a nuclear war. American commanders thought they were conducting routine anti-submarine operations. They had no idea Soviet submarines carried nuclear torpedoes. They didn't learn the truth until 2002, when Soviet military archives were finally declassified after the Cold War ended. One man said no. That's the only reason you're reading this sentence. If Vasily Arkhipov had agreed with his captain, if he had authorized that launch, you would not exist. Your parents would not have existed. Human civilization would have ended in nuclear fire in October 1962. One submarine officer's decision determined whether the human species survived, and he made that decision while suffocating in a disabled submarine being pounded by depth charges, with his commanding officers screaming at him to fire. The arms race that began with Klaus Fuchs passing manila envelopes to Harry Gold in Santa Fe had led directly to that moment in the Caribbean. The chain of causation was direct and undeniable. Fuchs gave Stalin the bomb. Stalin's bomb forced Truman to build the hydrogen bomb. The hydrogen bomb forced Khrushchev to deploy missiles to Cuba. The missiles in Cuba nearly triggered the war that would have ended everything. By the time the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, both superpowers had spent approximately $4 trillion on nuclear weapons programs. $4 trillion building weapons designed to destroy each other completely. The arsenals peaked in 1985 at more than 60,000 total warheads. After the Cold War ended, both sides began reducing stockpiles under arms control treaties. By 2020, the number had dropped to approximately 13,000 warheads. But 13,000 is still enough to end civilization. Right now, this moment, as you read this, there are 13,000 nuclear warheads on Earth. Several thousand are on high alert, ready to launch within minutes. The flight time from a Russian missile silo to Washington, D.C. is 30 minutes. To London, 20 minutes. The warning time for detecting an incoming attack is approximately 15 minutes. 15 minutes to determine if radar signatures are real missiles or computer errors. 15 minutes to decide whether to launch a counterstrike. 15 minutes to decide whether to end human civilization. This has nearly happened by accident multiple times. In 1983, Soviet early warning systems detected 5 American ICBMs launching toward Moscow. The officer on duty, Stanislav Petrov, had minutes to decide whether to report the attack to Soviet leadership, which would trigger automatic retaliation. Petrov decided the warning was a false alarm and didn't report it. He was correct. It was a computer error caused by sunlight reflecting off clouds. If Petrov had followed procedure and reported the attack, Soviet missiles would have launched automatically. Nuclear war would have started because of a computer glitch and reflected sunlight. Klaus Fuchs died in 1988, still believing he had prevented World War III by creating nuclear balance between superpowers. Theodore Hall died in 1999, never prosecuted, never imprisoned, convinced to the end that he had acted morally by sharing atomic secrets with Stalin. Both men genuinely believed they had saved the world. But the final irony came in 1992, when Soviet archives were partially opened after the USSR collapsed. Historians discovered that Stalin's regime had never seriously considered using nuclear weapons offensively, even during periods when the Soviet Union had atomic bombs and Western Europe had none. Stalin viewed nuclear weapons as defensive deterrents, not offensive tools. The American nuclear monopoly that Fuchs feared would be used for blackmail was never actually used that way. Truman never threatened nuclear attacks against the Soviet Union. The catastrophe Fuchs was trying to prevent by sharing secrets probably wouldn't have happened even if he had kept them. We'll never know for certain what would have happened in a world where the Soviet Union didn't get the bomb until the mid-1950s. We only know what did happen. Klaus Fuchs passed atomic secrets to the Soviets. The Soviets built the bomb years ahead of schedule. The Americans responded by building hydrogen bombs. The Soviets matched them. The cycle continued for 45 years until both sides possessed enough weapons to destroy Earth's ecosystem multiple times over. On August 6, 1945, the United States dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. That was the last time nuclear weapons were used in war. For 80 years since, humanity has lived under nuclear threat without experiencing nuclear war. Whether that counts as success or merely delayed catastrophe depends on your perspective. The weapons still exist. The knowledge still exists. The threat still exists. And it all traces back to manila envelopes passed on street corners in Santa Fe by men who believed they were preventing war. Klaus Fuchs thought he was saving the world. He was actually arming it with enough weapons to end it. And we're still living in the world he created, where peace is maintained by the promise that if anyone starts a war, everyone dies. That's the legacy of the stolen bomb. Not security, not balance, just permanent terror masked as strategy. The doomsday clock ticking forward, and nobody knows how to turn it back.